On the morning of the 5th of April, 1242 AD, the blinding glare of a spring sun reflected off the frozen expanse of Lake Peipus, masking the exact depth and condition of the ice beneath the hooves of advancing war horses. Across this frozen frontier between modern Estonia and Russia, a heavily armored wedge of the Livonian Order, a hardened branch of the Teutonic Knights, marched steadily toward the waiting lines of Prince Alexander Nevsky and the Novgorod Republic. For centuries, the ensuing battle on the ice has been remembered through a lens of cinematic myth, framed as a divine miracle where the frozen lake simply opened up and swallowed an army of Western Crusaders. But the truth of how a Rus prince neutralized the finest heavy cavalry in Northern Europe is not a story of sudden supernatural intervention. It is a documented masterclass in tactical withdrawal, environmental manipulation, and holding a desperate infantry line against overwhelming psychological pressure. The Crusaders did not simply fall through the ice by blind chance. They were deliberately drawn into a geographical bottleneck that negated their charge momentum and exposed their flanks to envelopment. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today we break down the battle on the ice, the deployment, the historical truth behind the sinking knights, and how one prince halted the Catholic push into Orthodox lands during the Northern Crusades. To understand the collision on the ice, one must first look at the strategic map of Eastern Europe in the mid-13th century. The Rus principalities were caught in a geopolitical vice, facing simultaneous existential threats from two directions. To the south and east, the Mongols had already swept through the steppes, systematically reducing the great cities of Kievan Rus to ash. By 1240 AD, the traditional center of Rus power had collapsed under the weight of the Golden Horde, leaving the Northern Mercantile Republic of Novgorod isolated as the last major independent Orthodox power. But while the Mongol yoke demanded immense tribute and political submission, the threat approaching from the west demanded the total eradication of their religious and cultural identity. This western threat was driven by the Northern Crusades, a sustained, papal-backed military campaign to forcibly Christianize the pagan tribes of the Baltic and push the borders of Latin Christendom eastward into Orthodox territory. The vanguard of this holy war was the Livonian Order. Originally founded as the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, they had been severely depleted in combat before being absorbed into the formidable Teutonic Order in 1237 AD. These men were not undisciplined feudal levies fighting for seasonal plunder. The Livonian Order functioned as an industrialized, multinational military corporation. They financed their campaigns through Baltic trade monopolies and secured their conquered territories by erecting a rigid theocratic state. The rhythmic strike of iron tools against limestone echoed across the Baltic pine forests as the order cemented its dominion, building massive stone fortresses to lock down newly conquered rivers and supply routes. By 1240 AD, the Livonian Knights turned their strategic focus toward the wealthy trade networks of the Novgorod Republic. Their first primary objective was the city of Pskov, a heavily fortified settlement that served as Novgorod's vital southern shield. But the order understood that political warfare was often more efficient than a protracted siege. Instead of relying solely on catapults and starvation, the Crusaders exploited the fragile political landscape of the Rus principalities. Factionalism within Pskov proved fatal. A group of disaffected local boyars, the landowning nobility, colluded with the Teutonic commanders. Led by a nobleman named Verdila, these internal factions simply opened the city gates to the invaders. The sudden fall of Pskov granted the Livonian Order a forward operating base deep inside Rus territory, completely bypassing Novgorod's primary defensive frontier. With Pskov garrisoned by Teutonic Brother Knights and their Chutian infantry auxiliaries, the Crusader net tightened rapidly around Novgorod. Through 1240 and 1241 AD, Livonian raiding parties pushed aggressively eastward, choking off vital agricultural supplies and seizing the strategic regional fortress of Koporye. Teutonic patrols were soon spotted operating within 20 miles of Novgorod's city walls. The Mercantile Republic, governed by a citizen assembly heavily influenced by wealthy merchant boyars, plunged into panic as their trade routes collapsed and famine loomed. Facing the disciplined advance of the Northern Crusades, the city assembly suddenly realized the catastrophic cost of their own internal politics. Just months prior, paranoid about the growing centralization of military authority, the boyars had deliberately exiled the one tactical commander capable of halting the Livonian war machine. That commander was Alexander Yaroslavich. In July of 1240 AD, this 20-year-old prince had already proven his tactical brilliance by ambushing and routing a Swedish invasion force at the confluence of the Izhora and Neva rivers, earning the honorific Nevsky. But the Novgorod Republic was not a traditional monarchy. It was a state governed by the Wedge, a citizen assembly heavily influenced by wealthy merchant boyars. To them, Alexander was essentially a hired military contractor, retained to defend the borders, but strictly prohibited from interfering in civic governance. Following his decisive triumph over the Swedes, Alexander's soaring political popularity threatened the boyars' absolute control over the Republic's affairs. In a calculated but ultimately disastrous move to preserve their internal power, the assembly dismissed him, exiling the young hero to his family's appanage in Pereslaval. By the spring of 1241 AD, that political calculus had collapsed. With Livonian outposts strangling Novgorod's economic lifelines and Crusader patrols raiding within a day's march of the city walls, the Republic faced the imminent threat of total subjugation to a Catholic theocracy. Desperate, the Veche dispatched the Archbishop of Novgorod to Pereslaval, begging Alexander to return and assume command. Alexander accepted, but he returned not just as a subordinate. He demanded the full operational authority required to wage total war. He swiftly stabilized the immediate tactical zone, securing the primary supply routes and rallying the local urban militia to reinforce his elite druzhina, the heavy cavalry retinue that served as the core of his striking power. Rather than waiting behind the wooden walls of Novgorod for a protracted siege, Alexander launched a rapid winter counteroffensive. His primary objective was to sever the Teutonic operational base by retaking Pskov before the Crusaders could heavily reinforce the garrison. The logistics of a medieval winter campaign were brutally unforgiving. Alexander pushed his combined forces through the deep snow and biting, freezing winds of the Baltic winter march, advancing with a speed that entirely caught the Livonian garrison off guard. He surrounded Pskov, stormed its defenses, and executed the local boyars who had committed treason by handing the city to the order. By early 1242 AD, the strategic momentum had violently shifted back to the Rus. Seeking to exploit this sudden advantage, Alexander advanced westward into the territory of the Livonian Order's Chutian subjects, aiming to disrupt enemy supply lines through aggressive foraging and to force the Teutonic command into an open field engagement. He dispatched a forward reconnaissance element under the command of a trusted boyar, Domash Tverdislavich, to locate the Crusader army. But Alexander's aggressive push into enemy territory soon hit a wall of steel. Near the settlement of Must, his vanguard collided directly with the heavy cavalry of the newly marshaled Livonian main force and was systematically slaughtered. The destruction of his reconnaissance element stripped Alexander of his tactical initiative, forcing him into a perilous, immediate withdrawal that would dictate the exact terms of the coming battle. The annihilation of the vanguard at Must presented Alexander Nevsky with a grim reality. The Livonian Order had mobilized its main army much faster than anticipated. Facing a highly disciplined, fully armored Crusader force on the open plains of early spring was a tactical death sentence for the Rus infantry. Alexander immediately countermanded his offensive advance and ordered a full tactical withdrawal eastward toward the borderlands of the Novgorod Republic. The logistical burden of conducting a fighting retreat with an army of roughly 4,000 to 5,000 men, moving supply wagons, urban militia, and heavy cavalry ahead of a pursuing enemy, required absolute discipline. He directed his forces toward the vast expanse of Lake Peipus, seeking a specific geographic bottleneck that could structurally neutralize the Livonian military machine. He found that bottleneck at a narrow strait connecting the northern and southern halves of the lake, an area known as Lake Tyoploye, near a prominent terrain feature called Raven's Rock. This was not a desperate, blind flight. It was a calculated manipulation of the environment. Alexander deliberately led his army across the frozen surface to the eastern shore, anchoring his rear against the steep, wooded banks and the rugged, uneven terrain of the shoreline. By choosing this exact position, he dictated the rules of engagement. If the Teutonic Knights wanted to destroy the Rus army, they would have to cross the ice and attack head-on. The brilliance of this deployment lay in how it actively degraded the Livonian Order's primary weapon, the heavy cavalry charge. On a dry, open plain, Crusader knights could maneuver freely, build devastating momentum, and easily flank an exposed infantry line. On the slick, unpredictable surface of an early April lake, traction was severely compromised. The heavy warhorses could not accelerate to their maximum shock speed without slipping, and the narrow confines of the strait naturally funneled the advancing army into a tightly packed corridor. Furthermore, by backing his infantry directly against the shoreline, Alexander completely removed the Crusaders' ability to envelop his wings. The Teutonic Knights were forced into a pure frontal assault over compromised terrain. By the 5th of April, 1242 AD, the Rus forces had completed their crossing. The deep, settling groans of the shifting spring ice echoed beneath their boots as the militiamen formed their layered defensive lines and readied their spears. Alexander had perfectly utilized the geography to strip the Crusaders of their mobility, funneling them exactly where he wanted them. The trap was meticulously set, but its success hinged entirely on one terrifying variable. Everything depended on whether the Novgorod infantry could withstand the initial impact of the most devastating cavalry formation in medieval Europe. For centuries, cinematic portrayals and national mythologies have inflated the battle on the ice into a sprawling clash of 100,000 men, painting it as a colossal, apocalyptic collision between East and West. The historical reality, however, was far more focused and infinitely more lethal. This was not a war of sprawling hordes, but a brutal, calculated engagement between highly specialized, relatively compact medieval retinues. The Crusader army, commanded by Prince Bishop Hermann of Dorpat, numbered roughly 1,000 to 2,000 men. At the absolute core of this force were the Brother Knights of the Livonian Order, a small but devastating contingent of fully professed, heavily armored warrior monks. They were supported by secular Danish knights, German mercenaries, and a larger body of lightly armed Estonian and Chudian infantry levies whose primary battlefield role was to protect the vulnerable flanks and rear of the heavy cavalry. To maximize the shock value of their elite vanguard, the Crusaders deployed in a specialized tactical formation known as the Schweinekopf, or the Swine's Head. This was a deeply packed, triangular cavalry wedge, explicitly designed to act as a medieval armor-piercing projectile. The point of the wedge consisted of the most heavily armored brother knights mounted on barded war horses, with the formation widening progressively at the rear to include lighter cavalry and supporting infantry. Once set in motion, the iron boar relied entirely on overwhelming, rigid forward momentum. Its sole operational purpose was to strike the exact center of an enemy line, shatter its cohesion through sheer kinetic force, and allow the trailing infantry to exploit the resulting rupture. On a dry, open field, it was a nearly unstoppable tactic. Facing this concentrated spearhead, Prince Alexander Nevsky commanded a larger, but more heterogeneous, force of roughly 4,000 to 5,000 men. While he held a clear numerical advantage, medieval battles were rarely decided by sheer numbers. They were dictated by unit cohesion, armor, and terrain positioning. Alexander's center was anchored by the Novgorod urban militia, foot soldiers armed with long spears, axes, and halberds. They were not full-time professional soldiers, but they were fighting for their immediate survival and the defense of their republic, arrayed in deeply layered ranks to absorb the anticipated cavalry shock. Crucially, Alexander did not commit his best troops to the center. He stationed his druzhina, the heavily armored, veteran Rus cavalry, on his left and right flanks, keeping them held in strict, disciplined reserve. The tactical contrast between the two armies was stark. The rigidly concentrated, offensive mass of the Teutonic Wedge was advancing toward a wide defensive crescent backed against the treacherous, uneven shoreline of Lake Tyoploye. The morning air was bitterly cold, and a low, thick spring fog clung to the frozen surface of the lake, briefly obscuring the exact distance between the two lines until the muffled, rhythmic thud of hundreds of armored war horses began to vibrate through the ice beneath the militia's boots. Alexander's spearmen braced their weapons and held their ground in disciplined silence. As the morning fog finally cleared on the 5th of April, 1242 AD, the Crusaders locked their visors, lowered their heavy lances into striking position, and the iron boar began its deadly acceleration across the ice. The collision at Raven's Rock was not a fluid clash of maneuvering armies, but a concentrated, brutal transfer of kinetic energy. When the apex of the Livonian Wedge struck the center of the Novgorod militia, the impact was devastating. The Schweinekopf was engineered for precisely this purpose, to concentrate maximum armored mass against a single focal point, shattering infantry cohesion before the defenders could effectively deploy their polearms. For the militiamen standing in the vanguard, the psychological terror of facing a tightly packed wall of charging, barded war horses was absolute. Despite their layered defensive ranks and braced spears, the sheer physical momentum of the Teutonic heavy cavalry was overwhelming. The brother knights at the tip of the formation drove their lances deep into the Rus lines, trampling the forward ranks and violently cleaving the Novgorod center in two. The initial phase of the engagement proceeded exactly according to the Livonian tactical doctrine. Historical accounts from the period, including the Novgorod First Chronicle, starkly acknowledge the brutal efficiency of the Crusader assault, noting simply that the invaders forced their way through the regiment. The militia's center ruptured under the sheer weight of the armored spearhead, yielding ground and fracturing into isolated pockets of desperate combat. Prince Bishop Hermann's vanguard had successfully penetrated the primary defensive screen, cutting a bloody corridor through the citizen soldiers of the Republic. However, the very success of this breakthrough immediately triggered the geographical failsafe that Alexander Nevsky had meticulously prepared. The Teutonic Wedge possessed unparalleled offensive power, but it was a rigid formation that entirely depended on continuous forward momentum to survive. As the brother knights drove through the shattered militia, they did not break out into an open plain where they could wheel and flank the remaining defenders. Instead, they slammed directly into the steep, rugged banks and dense woods of the eastern shoreline. The terrain abruptly choked their advance. The heavy warhorses, exhausted from the initial charge and confined by the narrow strait of Lake Tyoploye, could no longer accelerate. Stripped of their kinetic advantage, the Crusaders found themselves bogged down in a static melee. The chaotic, metallic clamor of heavy axes and halberds repeatedly striking iron armor echoed across the frozen lake, punctuated by the frantic, scraping sound of barded warhorses, hooves desperately struggling for traction on ice that was now slick with blood and slush. In a standstill fight, the heavy cavalry was highly vulnerable to dismounted infantry armed with polearms and unhorsing hooks. Furthermore, the tightly packed nature of the Livonian Wedge, which had been its greatest strength during the charge, now became a fatal liability. The brother knights were compressed into a disorganized mass against the shoreline, unable to maneuver or deploy their supporting Teuton light infantry effectively. Despite the mounting friction and the loss of operational mobility, the Livonian command remained entirely focused on the shattered Rus vanguard. Looking down from their stalled war horses at the broken ranks of the Novgorod militia, the Teutonic commanders assessed the ruptured lines and concluded that the primary defensive structure of the Republic had been destroyed. The center had collapsed, and the Crusaders firmly believed they had won the engagement. But they had merely stepped perfectly into the jaws of Alexander's design. As the Teutonic vanguard ground to a stagnant halt against the steep eastern shore, the true architecture of Alexander Nevsky's defense finally revealed itself. The collapse of the Novgorod center had not been a failure of the Rus lines, but a calculated absorption. Alexander had demanded immense discipline from his army, forcing his left and right flanks, anchored by his veteran, heavily armored druzhina, to stand completely fast while their comrades in the vanguard were slaughtered. He waited until the Livonian Wedge had fully committed itself, bleeding off every ounce of its forward kinetic energy into the rugged terrain. Only when the Crusader momentum was entirely spent did the Prince of Novgorod unleash his reserves. With a single tactical shift, the untouched Rus flanks swept inward, driving directly into the elongated, vulnerable sides of the stalled Livonian formation. The Schweinekopf was exclusively an instrument of offensive shock. Tactically, it offered almost zero defensive flexibility once its forward advance was halted. Packed shoulder to shoulder to maximize the weight of their charge, the brother knights and German mercenaries now found themselves physically trapped by their own deployment. They lacked the spatial clearance to wheel their barded warhorses and face the fresh Rus cavalry crashing into their periphery. The enveloping wings methodically clamped down on the Crusader flanks, completely stripping the knights of their mobility. What Prince Bishop Hermann's commanders had perceived as a decisive breakthrough just moments before was, in reality, a lethal, deeply layered encirclement. The survival of the Teutonic heavy cavalry in a prolonged, static melee depended entirely on their rear guard. The massive wedge relied on a wide screen of Teuton and Estonian light infantry to secure its flanks and prevent envelopment. However, these auxiliaries were not zealous, ideologically driven crusaders. They were recently subjugated Baltic peoples, conscripted by force to serve as the expendable vanguard of an imperial theocracy. When the Teuton levies saw the elite druzhina cavalry sweeping around the perimeter and witnessed the invincible brother knights bogged down in a desperate standstill, their morale shattered. Recognizing a tactical disaster, the auxiliary lines immediately dissolved. Without advancing to relieve the besieged knights, the vast majority of the Livonian infantry broke formation, discarded their weapons, and fled westward across the ice. This mass desertion instantly severed the Livonian command structure, leaving the heavy cavalry completely isolated in hostile territory. Surrounded on three sides by advancing infantry and blocked by the shoreline to their front, the Teutonic Knights were forced into a grinding battle of attrition that favored the unmounted defenders. The frigid air grew heavy with the sharp scent of iron sweat and the exhausted, heaving breath. Exploiting the Knights' lack of mobility, the Rus citizen soldiers deployed specialized anti-cavalry tactics. They utilized long, hooked poles and heavy axes to snag armor and reins, systematically dragging the top-heavy Crusader elites from their saddles and into the crushing press of the melee. Stripped of their momentum and abandoned by their support, the vaunted military machine of the Northern Crusades was being systematically dismantled, piece by piece. Recognizing that their holy war had collapsed into a rapidly shrinking kill zone, the surviving Teutonic commanders abandoned any remaining pretense of victory. Command and control disintegrated as blind panic finally overtook the rigid discipline of the order. The remaining knights brutally forced their exhausted horses around, fighting their way back through the thinning rear of the pocket to break the encirclement. They spurred their mounts back toward the open ice, seeking the safety of the western shore. But this frantic withdrawal across the vast frozen expanse of Lake Tyoploye would not bring them salvation. It would instead initiate a desperate 7-kilometer pursuit that would forever cement the battle into legendary myth. The disintegration of the Teutonic Wedge transformed the engagement from a static battle of attrition into a chaotic 7-kilometer running slaughter. As the surviving brother knights and German mercenaries broke the encirclement, they spurred their exhausted mounts back across the frozen expanse of Lake Tyoploye toward the western Subolich shore. In medieval warfare, a disciplined retreat is extraordinarily difficult, but a routed flight is almost always fatal. Stripped of their infantry screen and their rigid formation, the retreating heavy cavalry were completely exposed. Alexander Nevsky immediately unleashed his light cavalry and mounted archers to pursue the fleeing Crusaders. The Rus riders harassed the fragmented groups of knights, systematically cutting down stragglers and preventing any reorganization across a pursuit distance of 7 versts. It is within this desperate flight across the lake that historical reality and popular mythology fatally diverge. For modern audiences, the battle on the ice is inextricably linked to the dramatic imagery cemented by 20th century cinema, a climax where the frozen surface dramatically shatters beneath the Crusaders, plunging the armored invaders into the freezing depths. However, an analytical review of the earliest primary texts reveals a starkly different narrative. Neither the Novgorod First Chronicle, written shortly after the event, nor the Livonian Rhymed Chronicle, the primary Teutonic source, explicitly records the ice breaking and swallowing the Crusader army during the battle. The earliest accounts attribute the victory entirely to the tactical superiority of the Rus envelopment and the relentless pursuit. This does not mean the environmental dangers of the spring thaw were purely fictitious. By early April, the ice covering Lake Peipus and the narrow Strait of Tyoploye was fundamentally unstable, particularly near the shorelines, where underwater currents and thinning edges created treacherous zones. As the retreating, panicked Crusaders bunched together, the concentrated weight of armored men and barded war horses undoubtedly stressed the fragile surface. It is highly probable that localized fracturing occurred during the rout, with the sharp, echoing crack of giving ice plunging isolated groups of fleeing knights into the lethal, freezing water below. But this environmental hazard was merely an agonizing complication of the retreat, not the primary tactical mechanism that destroyed the Livonian military machine. Alexander Nevsky defeated the Northern Crusades through disciplined infantry lines and a masterly flanking maneuver, not through supernatural weather. The true tragedy for the Teutonic Knights lay in the undeniable butcher's bill of the engagement. The Livonian rhymed chronicle candidly records the massive proportional losses suffered by the Order's inner circle. 20 fully professed brother knights were killed in combat, and another 6 were captured alive. To a modern observer accustomed to the inflated casualty figures of industrial warfare, 26 men might seem statistically insignificant, but within the strictly hierarchical, specialized structure of a medieval military order, this represented a catastrophic blow. These were not replaceable foot soldiers. They were the elite, heavily armored command structure of the theocracy, men who required years of specialized training and immense financial capital to deploy. Their destruction on the ice of Lake Tyoploye stripped the Livonian Order of its offensive vanguard and effectively decapitated its leadership structure in the region. The holy war against the Novgorod Republic had violently collapsed. The Livonian Order had been decimated, but the consequences of this frozen clash would echo far beyond the battlefield, reshaping the borders of Europe for centuries. The immediate consequence of the slaughter on Lake Tyoploye was a total strategic collapse of the Crusader offensive. By the summer of 1242 AD, the shattered Livonian Order formally sued for peace. The resulting treaty was an absolute concession. The Teutonic Knights officially renounced all territorial claims to the lands of the Novgorod Republic, surrendering Pskov, Izborsk, and all other recently captured fortifications. Alexander Nevsky had not merely won a local engagement. He had permanently halted the eastward expansion of the papal-backed Northern Crusades. The battle firmly established a rigid geographical and ideological frontier between Catholic Northern Europe and the Orthodox principalities of Rus, a cultural fault line that has persisted across Eastern Europe for nearly 8 centuries. For Alexander, the victory secured his political dominance over the Republic's factious boyars and elevated him from a hired military contractor to a foundational figure of national survival. Recognizing his paramount role in preserving the Orthodox faith against the existential threat of Latin assimilation, the Russian Orthodox Church would later canonize him as a saint. Yet, it is the battle itself that underwent the most profound historical transformation. Over the centuries, a brilliantly executed tactical withdrawal and a highly disciplined double envelopment were gradually rewritten by later chronicles, nationalist folklore, and eventually cinematic spectacle into a convenient, dramatic narrative of divine intervention and shattering ice. The true historical weight of the battle on the ice does not lie in the legendary depths of a frozen lake, but in the brutal reality of medieval command. It remains a definitive testament to how meticulous terrain analysis, iron infantry discipline, and the precise exploitation of an enemy's rigid tactical momentum can dismantle a seemingly invincible military machine. Thank you for watching World Chronicles. Subscribe to our channel to relive the great chapters of history together, and join us for the next episode.